The Brexit circus is back here in Westminster. But could it be moving to a street near you if the government finally gets its way and calls a general election? It was billed as Super Saturday, but it turned out to be a damp squib. The much-anticipated vote on the government's Brexit withdrawal agreement didn't even take place.
MPs have backed an amendment which says that you can't have a vote on the final Brexit deal until all the legislation has been passed by the Commons.
The government tried again on Monday. This time, it was thwarted by the Speaker.
The motion will not be debated today, as it would be repetitive and disorderly.
Here it is, in all its glory.
The government published its lengthy withdrawal agreement bill, but said MPs could have just 3 days to debate it.
Unless you are a lawyer, have you properly really understood it?
If we pass this deal and the legislation that enables it, we can turn the page.
Nothing less than a charter for deregulation and a race to the bottom.
The Prime Minister threatened those kicking against the quick passage of the bill.
The bill will have to be pulled. We'll have to go forward to a general election.
Then, amid the confusion, a rare victory.
Parliament has approved tonight for the first time a version of Brexit.
How welcome it is, even joyful.
But it did not have the votes to impose its tight timetable, so that the first stage of Brexit could be done by the end of the month.
Tonight, the House has refused to be bounced into debating a hugely significant piece of legislation in just 2 days.
One way or another, we will leave the EU with this deal.
The bill is in limbo.
Now it's up to the EU to grant the extension the Prime Minister didn't want.
My bags are always packed for Brussels, and packed they are again.
Tonight I ask the Justice Secretary, Robert Buckland, what happens next.
And best of all, no Brexit at all.
And the People's Vote campaigner, Alastair Campbell, if hopes for a second referendum are now dead. Good evening. We're live from Westminster, where it's finally dawned that October the 31st is just, well, Halloween and nothing else. No Brexit Day, no deal, no deal, no second referendum, no election. Now, kids are fond of dressing up as zombies at Halloween, but for this zombie parliament, every day is now Halloween. For the moment, the small matter of what happens next has been outsourced to Brussels, where the EU will decide if we can have an extension to our EU membership and for how long. Once it's told us of its decision, we don't know if the government will use the extra time to try again to get its deal through Parliament or force an election. We do know that no matter how much time is allowed for scrutiny, the opposition parties are set on opposing the Johnson deal. But we don't yet know if they're coming round to the idea of an election or what more reasons they may yet find for delaying it. Thus does the great British zombie stalemate continue, and British politics continues its sojourn through the long night of the living dead. So, where next? Earlier I spoke to Cabinet Minister Robert Buckland. He's the Justice Secretary. Robert Buckland, are we still leaving on October the 31st?
Well, I certainly want to, and so does the Prime Minister. Of course, the ball is now in the court of the Europeans. They're going to consider whether or not to offer us an extension. But as we speak now, the default date is the 31st of October. And if Parliament doesn't agree to a deal, we leave without a deal, which is, I don't think, what anybody wants.
So we're not leaving then?
Well, let's wait to see what the Europeans have to offer us. I'm not going to prejudge. I'm hearing lots of talk about an extension, but we don't know yet the shape and the size of it and any conditions that they may put upon it as well.
But the Prime Minister promised we'd leave on the 31st without caveat. Indeed, do or die, come what may, he said. And he's not delivered. Another broken promise.
Well, I think the Prime Minister has actually delivered on a heck of a lot in 3
He's not delivered on October the 31st, which he said, do or die, he'd rather end up in a ditch. Has he prepared the ditch?
Well, look, he's been trying every day to get this sorted. We were told that he wouldn't get an amended deal with the Europeans. He did. We were told he wouldn't get it through Parliament. He started that process. It is Parliament's decision not to allow a timetable for us to get on with this. Parliament has the responsibility for this, and so far they've not lived up to that.
But he knew all that when he was making these promises. He knew he didn't have a majority. He knew that there was a large Remainer element in this Parliament. He was warned not just by the media or by Labour politicians, he was warned by his own side during the Tory leadership contest. Jeremy Hunt and Michael Gove, they both warned that leaving on October was unlikely. But he carried on with this foolish and false bravado.
Well, I think the Prime Minister was right to be clear. We needed somebody with the resolution. No, I don't
What's
think
the point of being
fair,
clear
Andrew.
if you're wrong?
I don't think that's fair because
we're not leaving on October the 31st.
But, Andrew, the date of the 31st of October was chosen not by us, but by the EU. That was the date that they decided back in the spring was convenient for them. It was right. It was in their interests. And therefore, the Prime Minister was correct to work to that date, correct to recognise the needs of the Europeans.
I mean, I think honesty does matter. These things are complicated, but this is quite simple. We are not leaving on October the 31st. Let's be honest.
Well, look, it's up to the Europeans now. I don't know what their position is going to be. I think that Parliament have made it much more difficult. I accept that. And I think not having a timetable means that the practicalities of leaving become really complicated, which is why the Prime Minister said what he did last night in pausing the bill and having to wait for the Europeans to make a decision. That's not where we wanted to be, Andrew.
I know it's not where you want to be, but I'm trying to get some honesty in where you are, because this is a Prime Minister with previous on this, isn't it? He said he wasn't attracted to suspending Parliament. He then prorogued it, unlawfully as it turned out. He said he wouldn't ask for an extension beyond October the 31st. He has asked for an extension. He said Parliament would have plenty of time to debate Brexit. Then he tried to ram his Brexit deal through in 3 days. I mean, no wonder Parliament doesn't trust him.
Well, no, three things there. First of all, when there was a discussion in the leadership election about prorogation, the talk was then about prorogation over this period. So there's a difference there. Secondly, when it comes to what he wanted to do with regard to debate, there have been 3 years of debate about the detail of this. And
not on his deal.
Yeah, but on the detail of the withdrawal agreement, which substantially has been retained by the Europeans from the deal we saw in the spring, we've had days, weeks, months of debate on that detail.
Your Brexit secretary couldn't even answer questions accurately when he was in front of a select committee of the Commons. He's not over the detail. Why would Parliament get over it in 3 days?
Well, I think Parliament have shown a marked ability to get over detail. I think Parliament's more than equipped to get on with it. There might be another agenda here, dare I suggest, from some parliamentarians who don't want Brexit to happen at all.
Right. No, I understand that. But it's the Prime Minister who made a fetish of October the 31st. It may have been the date set by the EU, but he was the one that made it a fetish of it, his do-or-die promise. But there's nothing magical about October the 31st. Why doesn't the government say, OK, we'll have some more time to scrutinise this. We'll have another 3 or 4 weeks to do it, and then we can leave.
Yeah, but Andrew, it's not in our gift to suddenly pluck a date out of the air. The process now has been put in place by the Ben Act. We've complied with that. We're waiting for the Europeans to come back with a date.
Right.
But I think the PM was bang on right when he's delivered with clarity the need to get Brexit done. Fixing on that date, I think, was the right approach. It was clear, it was unambiguous, and it's actually, I think, prompted the negotiation that has resulted in this amendment.
And that may be the case. But that date has gone. And the Europeans are likely to come back with an extension. We don't know how long, but they've certainly said we're not going to be the ones that cause no deal. And the only way we can now leave at the end of this month is a no deal. So they're going to give us an extension. So if you get in this extension, when they announce it, why not say, we're now going to timetable the motion again. It's past its second reading. This time we're going to give 3 or 4 weeks. We're going to get this through, and then we leave on November the 30th. Why not?
Because I think it's important that we stick to the lath about getting Brexit done. And I think it's perhaps easy for us to get into a situation where, in effect, we're facilitating more delay. That was the mistake that was made before. But you're going to be delaying this,
whatever happens.
But I think, Andrew, it's important that as a negotiating party, we are clear. We have complied with our obligations. The letter's gone. The Europeans are considering the matter. I think for us to start to get involved and barter about dates actually would once again put us into an unclear position extension, ambiguous about Brexit. That has led us to more dithering and more uncertainty.
But we've been at this for over 3.5 years. What's the difference between leaving on October the 31st or leaving on November the 30th?
Well, look, in terms of the date, I mean, you on one level, you have a very valid point about dates, but on another deeper level here, the British public have been waiting and waiting and waiting. We were told the 29th of March, that was a big date set in stone. That then was lost. I think the public are let's face it, right to be rather fed up of more delay and more dithering, which is why it's good to have a Prime Minister who is clear and ambiguous, wants to sort this out. Yes, he's used strong language. I agree with that. And the talking up of no deal has alarmed some, but the government would be failing in its duty if it hadn't made those preparations, made everybody clear that we were serious about Brexit, single-minded, really clear in our
Right, but it has failed in
its
duty, or failed in its promise, which was to leave on October the 31st. So you say you want to be clear. So let's be clear. When the EU does give us an extension, it may be a month, could be 3 months. We don't know, but it's going to give us an extension. What is the government's preference when it gets that? Is it a short delay to get Brexit done during November and maybe a bit of December? Or is it a general election before Christmas?
Well, we think now that with Parliament having done what it did last night, the only way to break the deadlock is by having a general election. And frankly, we need one sooner rather than later. I think having one this year, however inhospitable the weather might be, is the way to break the deadlock. That's what the Prime Minister has indicated. It's not, I think, where any of us particularly want to be, but Parliament has failed to really pave the way for Brexit, and therefore we need a new one.
Let me just clarify this, Minister. Are you saying to our viewers tonight that when the EU comes back with an extension to our membership, that it will be the policy of the government not to then attempt to ratify the withdrawal agreement, but to try and force an election?
Well, if we end up with an extension for months and months and months, I think the only way through is an election. I don't know precisely what the Europeans are going to say. I think I learnt from last time, Andrew, that they came up with, as we said, the date that was different from the one we asked for, and a whole set of a rationale that was their own. I'm not going to try and gainsay what they're going to do, but what I would say is that I think with Parliament having done what it did last night, an election seems to be the only way forward.
Preferable to trying to get the deal through in this Parliament?
Well, look, I want the deal to be done.
Yeah, but is it preferable, Minister? Well, clarity you promised us. What's the answer?
Well, look, I don't think this Parliament seems to want to get a deal through, and therefore we need a new one.
You've tried to trigger an election twice and failed because it's no longer in the government's gift, as it used to be entirely. How are you going to get one this time?
Well, it's a challenge because of that two-thirds rule in the Fixed Term Parliaments Act. There's been talk about a single clause bill, which of course could be amended in ways perhaps the government wouldn't like. I don't pretend it's going to be easy, but let's not forget where the main opposition party's been on this. They have indicated that if there is an extension, they will finally vote for a general election. The rhetoric of the Leader of the Opposition has been that he wants an election. He's been gagging for it, and yet they failed to vote for it twice. Let's see whether this time
they go for it. Let me ask you, Minister, in our final minutes about the substance of this deal, this Johnson deal, which passed the House by 30 votes, unlike the May deal, which lost by 230 on its first outing. It's an achievement, I give you that. But the Prime Minister has said there will be no checks on goods moving between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. The Brexit Secretary says there will be. Who's right?
Well, there will be some checks because of the nature of the single market rules that would apply in Northern Ireland. I accept that. And there's even going to be a check the other way, in particular with regard to endangered species. Yes, there will be some qualitative change. But, Andrew, I mean...
And tariffs?
Well, they will be in the same customs arrangement. But if those goods are going into the EU, as opposed to just Northern Ireland, there has to be some tariff element because, of course, Northern Ireland will be part of the customs area.
So there'll have to be tariffs. If the goods stay in Northern Ireland, the tariffs will be refunded, as I understand it.
Yeah.
If they go to the Republic, then the tariffs will remain. It covers the single market problem. Why then did the Prime Minister say to the Commons there are no checks, Great Britain to Northern Ireland?
Well, look, I don't have the transcript of precisely what was said before me. I don't pretend that this is
Well, let me read it
straightforward
then. I understand you can't have everything in your mind, and I've got the words. There are no checks between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. There will be some light touch measures to assure no illegal trade in endangered animal species and ban firearms. But that's not true, is it?
Well,
it's going to cover all goods going from from Great Britain to Northern Ireland.
I think he's making a distinction between administrative, what we used to call paperwork, a lot of it will be done digitally, and the sort of checks, you know, the actual physical checks that, of course, would have been a real issue when it comes to making sure that there was that seamlessness within Ireland. And, of course, that issue about the border east-west. I think there's a difference there.
But there will be checks.
Well, there will be some administrative procedures, and I think, you know...
Which is also known as checks.
Well, it could be, but I'd call it paperwork.
Well, otherwise, what's the point of having business fill in all this paperwork if at some stage somebody's not going to check it?
Yeah, but I think there's a difference between what might have been in his mind with regard to the sort of, you know, the border-style approach as opposed to more administration.
But for the first time, someone in Great Britain sending goods to Northern Ireland will need to fill in customs paperwork, could be subject to checks, and will face tariffs. That's the reality.
Only if they go into the EU, and secondly, there will be...
But you might not know that at the time.
But there also will be a list of exemptions and what we describe as a novel approach in order to minimise those arrangements. Look, Andrew, I'm not pretending that this is tidy and logical and perfect. We have to
messy
respect...
and expensive might be a better word.
We have to respect the position of Northern Ireland and the Republic, and that's what we're doing.
Final question, Minister. If not October the 31st, when now do we leave?
The Europeans will come up with a date. I hope that if they do want an extension, that it is clear and unambiguous and gives us the sort of cut-off point that can focus the minds here in Westminster to get on with the job. I think more...
So you want Europe to take the decision for you?
No, I want Westminster.
You want Europe to set a date and say thus far and no further. You're outsourcing it now to Europe.
I don't want to outsource. I've taken my responsibilities, as had the Prime Minister. Westminster has to step up to the plate here and get on with the job, make the decisions. As I said last night, the time for opposing everything and proposing nothing is gone. Okay. Let's get on with the decision.
Robert Buckland, thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
And in case you're wondering, we did ask the official opposition for an interview this evening, lots to talk about, but the Labour Party told us nobody was available. But what do this week's events mean for a second referendum? Many thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands took to the streets at the weekend to call for one here in Westminster. And I'm joined now by a leading member of the People's Vote campaign, Alastair Campbell. Welcome.
Thank you.
Your dream of a second referendum is fading fast, isn't it?
I don't think so. I think we've actually, the march at the weekend that you mentioned, I think was a sign of momentum. I think the fact that there are more and more MPs that we can now bring out to these events is a sign of that as well. I suspect if there had been an amendment, if the bill hadn't been paused and there'd been an amendment, I suspect right now, today, the numbers aren't there. But I've always felt that when parliamentarians realise that there is no other way of breaking this logjam, that the People's Vote is where it will go.
Well, it wasn't brought forward, even as your march was going on and all these people were outside Parliament, because those who wanted didn't think they had the votes. They lost 4 times in the past. Parliament has now voted for the Johnson Brexit deal on the second reading. Labour is talking more about a general election now. So I don't see the route to a second referendum.
Well, the route might be an election. But I also, let me say, I think an awful lot of Labour MPs and an awful lot of Tory MPs, including one that I just met on the stairs on the way up, are pretty clear that they don't want an election. The question then, you were discussing with Robert Buckland there, whether Johnson brings the bill, brings his agreement back. I think as that happens, then there could be amendments going down there. And also there was an amendment put last week. The Carl Wilson amendment was put, but it was against the option of no deal. So I still, look, put it this way, I accept the premise of your question in terms of, you know, we're not there yet, but I still think we're very much in the game.
But even if the withdrawal agreement, if it comes back before an election, and it was amended to put a second referendum onto it, the Johnson government is not going to provide the money vote to make that possible, and it needs government to do that. Nor is the Johnson government going to go and ask for a much longer extension from the EU to allow a referendum to take place. It's not going to happen.
Well, Andrew, may I just point out, in your excellent interview there, you went through a number of absolute cast iron things that Boris Johnson said he wouldn't do, and he ended up doing them. So I wouldn't actually rule that out either, that he becomes the one who thinks this is a last resort. And I do think now for the public, I accept the public is sick to death of this thing and just sort of, want shot of it. But the worst possible thing that I think we can do is that fatigue leading to doing something that actually could damage the country in many different ways, not least one of which you were discussing there in Northern Ireland and the State of the Union.
The harsh reality, though, for you is that although you want a referendum first rather than a general election, but the harsh reality really now is that your only likely route to a referendum is a general election, which Labour wins.
That is certainly a possible route. I still think there are routes now. I think that as Parliament, if the bill comes back, as that goes through, it becomes clear that the only way to get it through all its stages is by attaching a confirmatory referendum. I could see that might happen. And your point about Boris Johnson not doing it, the other route is that we then do get into the scenario of him being removed by Parliament and a caretaker government put there. But yes, I accept. And therefore, when it comes to an election, I think there will be a lot of tactical voting. I think there'll be people who will make their judgment according to how do I cast my vote best to stop Brexit or best to get another referendum.
But as you know better than anybody, momentum is everything in politics. And momentum at the moment is more behind an election than a referendum. The SNP is keen on an election this year for its own reasons of what might be happening in the Scottish courts in January. The Lib Dems seem to be moving in that direction. Jeremy Corbyn has told his own people, we just can't afford to turn down another election request. Even Gina Miller is talking today about another general election. The momentum is not with you.
Well, listen...
That's a small M momentum.
I know that, but the other momentum is certainly not with me. But I think that when you talk about the way this debate has gone, momentum has swung backwards and forwards in all sorts of directions. And look, we literally don't know at the moment what the European Union is going to respond into by way of extension. I suspect they will give an extension.
It's likely to be 3 months.
OK, that's right. Then we don't know what Boris Johnson's reaction to that is going to be. Yes, he can try to force the election, and yes, he might get it, but it's not guaranteed. Nothing at the moment is guaranteed, and he has no control over events.
The one thing that's sure is that if Labour formed the next government, even if it was with SNP and Lib Dem support in some form, then you would likely get a second referendum. That's party policy. What are the chances of that?
Of Labour forming a government?
Yeah.
I think the chances are there. I think
all chances are there. How big? How high?
I don't know, because I think things are so volatile. Look, you look at the opinion polls. Why does Boris Johnson want this general election? Because he seems to be ahead in the polls, just as Theresa May was. He knows that, I think deep down he knows that he wouldn't get a majority in a referendum. I think that's why he doesn't want one. He gets a majority, a substantial majority, in Parliament, if he gets sort of around the 35-36% mark. That's what he thinks he can get. But I think we're going into a period now where I think one of the things that's getting next to no coverage at the moment, normally Nigel Farage, in my view, gets too much coverage. I think he's getting next to no coverage for the fact he's actually saying some really interesting things at the moment. He's going to be a big player in the election if we're
You're quite shameless. You now want more Nigel Farage. To suit your purpose.
I don't want more Nigel Farage, but I think it's genuinely interesting, the take that he has on the deal, because people like me worry that Boris Johnson is going to throw the Labour MPs under the bus and the One Nation Tories under the bus, and Farage is obviously worried he's going to throw the ERG under the bus. We still don't know what sort of economy we're heading towards on the Johnson deal.
But I tell you what makes me think that that your organisation is wondering whether its time has come and gone, because you're now squabbling among yourselves. I mean, why did you want to get rid of Roland Rudd? He's an esteemed Remainer. He's was chair of the People's Vote campaign. You said
he's still chair of Open Britain.
Yeah, but you wanted to take him down fast and brutal.
I was actually, in that particular email, given to one of my biggest fans, the Mail on Sunday, which always present anything to do with me and Peter Mandelson very, very fairly, as I'm sure you'll recognise.
Yeah, it should happen soon and be fast and brutal.
Yes,
that's your email.
I was actually talking about other people who, at that time, were being particularly difficult. This campaign...
Hold on, you said, I don't see how this gets done without a public battle. now, and it should happen soon and be fast and brutal. That's
right, well,
you.
it's been none of those things, has it? It's
the
been
leopard
neither fast nor brutal.
The leopard doesn't change its spots.
Listen,
and you're working with Peter Mandelson to do it.
I have been involved in many, many campaigns, including with Peter Mandelson. I've actually been involved in very few campaigns that have been as successful as this one, in going from a standing start not that long ago to being able to get 1 million people out in the streets. And at the start of this campaign, we could get most of the MPs in the back of a cab. On Saturday, we had to turn them away from speaking for us.
All right. Alastair Campbell, thank you.
Thank you.
Now, in a moment, I'm going to be talking to our chief political correspondent, Vicky Young. She's going to be here in Westminster. But first to our Europe editor, Katja Adler, who's in Brussels. Katja, President Macron notwithstanding, is it now likely that the EU will grant an extension until the end of January? In other words, another 3 months?
Well, first of all, Andrew, it's very likely that the EU will grant an extension full stop, because not that long ago there was a big question mark over that. At the moment, most EU countries seem to favour basically giving the UK what it asked for, which is a 3-month extension ending on the 31st of January. There are about 4 countries, I'm told, that favour a shorter extension. First and foremost, the French president. But you know, people's minds are not made up. The President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, hasn't yet managed to speak to each individual leader. As I'm sure you can imagine, they're quite busy. Mr. Macron, for example, is on an island in the Indian Ocean, so they're not all necessarily that reachable.
He's run away. But, I don't blame him.
We do. He's back on Friday, and we expect a decision on Friday, and we expect no summit to be called. So EU leaders are really going to try and do this in writing.
Well, that would point to me as a 3-month extension. If it is, will it come with any conditions?
Well, look, we've been here before, haven't we? So when Theresa May asked for a Brexit extension, again, you know, EU leaders huff and they puff like they're doing now as well. You know, you can't just expect us always to give you another Brexit extension. You have to tell us what it's for. You know, we have to know that it's for something concrete. But I think in the end, legally, that's very difficult for the EU to do, to say we're only going to give you this if you hold a general election or something, because they can't really be seen to be interfering in the affairs of another member state. So I think that's talk for the moment, but it won't be walk, probably.
Katja, sorry to rush. I just thank you for joining us there. Just want to get to Vicky Young here in Westminster. Vicky Young, is it true tonight that the government's now divided, or Mr Johnson is getting conflicting advice between those in 10 Downing Street who want him to push for an election now, and some cabinet ministers that would prefer he put the Brexit deal back into the parliamentary process?
Yeah, I mean, Boris Johnson says it's in the hands of the EU, depending what kind of delay of Brexit that they give. So the decision he's going to have to make is going to be a very difficult one. Does he carry on with that bill, hoping that he can get it through? But in the process of doing that, he breaks that promise that he said again and again, we're going to leave the EU by the 31st of October. Is it worth that in order to get the deal through? And then at some point go into an election saying, look, I have delivered on Brexit. Or is it better to wait and to go into that election saying, I've got a deal, if you give me a majority, I will get Brexit delivered with this. But, you know, neither path is easy for him. And the problem and the risks, of course, for one, is that the bill goes through, but it gets changed and amended into something he doesn't want. And the risk, of course, of a general election is that ultimately he might lose his job. In
our final 30 seconds, Vicky, are the opposition parties now looking more kindly on an election, the SNP, Lib Dems, Labour?
They are, but it will need Labour votes if he does it under the Fixed Term Parliament Act. He'll need 2/3 of MPs to vote for it. And Labour on this are also split. There are many Labour MPs, I've spoken to some of them today, who do not want an election. And that's very hard for Jeremy Corbyn. Even if the numbers were there, if he goes into a vote and a large number of his own MPs say, we don't want an election, which might make you Prime Minister, that is not going to be a positive way for him to enter that contest.
All right. Vicky, thanks for joining us. That's it for tonight. I'll be back here with Politics Live at 12:15 tomorrow. And, of course, with this show again next Wednesday night here on BBC 2 at 7 o'clock. Don't miss it. Bye-bye.